Thanks for joining again. I'm Lene Ferretti, and I am the CEO of Bahavana World Project. We've been working in Africa for over 15 years in various capacities. Right now, part of this project is training and education for makers to understand a combination of AGOA and AGOA regulations, and then also U.S. market product standards and regulations, which is what we're going to talk about today. And so I don't want you to get overwhelmed by this. There's a lot of information that's very detailed. Save your questions to the end, or you can also pop them in the chat, and we'll take time after I walk through this to go through your questions, and make this as painless as possible. So let's get started. Just to remind you that this program, this training, is funded by USAID, Africa Trade and Investment Program, the new acronym ATI. And it is an extension of the Prosper Africa initiative started under the Obama administration to boost trade, increase investment, and support a healthy business environment across the entire continent, which is new. The entire continent part is new for ATI, but it has had a lot of interesting opportunities for cross-collaboration and education, working with the entire continent instead of strictly a region. Or a region. So they also do have a grants and subcontracts hub that offers up to $250,000 in grants, and is available to you. This is the information. You can check out grants and see if you would qualify and go through the proposal process, et cetera. So I always want to start with this because it's a very good opportunity for small businesses to access this funding without it's encumbered a bit with reporting, but it's not encumbered with the interest rates that come with more standard kind of banking arrangements. So thank you, ATI and USAID for that opportunity. So Anne is not joining me today. Anne is our colleague who is based in Kenya and is also doing training work with us. So I'm just flying solo today. So big welcome to all the Powered by People makers. Powered by People is, Bahavana is a social enterprise. We work with exporters across the world. We focus on SME and MSME, and we work in the textile apparel, home decor and accessories sectors. We also do buyer linkages work and training and education, and this falls under our training and education component. So there will be a recording. This recording will be available for anyone to access. And Jennifer, I should actually check on the one that you didn't get into and see if that one was done for Powered by People and see if the recording is up, because that might be an opportunity for you to review that information. That
would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, I will do that for you and try to send you an email by the end of the week. It was the AGOA training, right?
Yes, it was. Yes.
One of the first ones. Yes. Okay. I'll check on that with Annie for you.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. So the objective here is to overview our U.S. market regulation standards. And I'm going to do a little bit of textile because I know that textile home, even if it's not textile apparel, textile home is a big part of what you may all be doing with PBTP, as well as jewelry and leather products. Again, submit your questions via the chat. This is usually for a larger group. We're a really small group today. So hold your questions to the end or add them to the chat, whichever is best for you. So let's get started by talking about international standards at an overview level. So let's kind of pan back and just talk about what international standards are, what some of them are, and how, just to give you kind of a framework on international standards. So on the international standards piece, yes, there are legal requirements for particular buyers. And yes, there are legal requirements for just US customs. This is going to talk mostly about international buyer standards. And they can change based on the size of the buyer. Now, what that means is if you're selling, let's say you are selling on the PBP platform and you're shipping to a smaller boutique, one order to a smaller boutique, they would be called kind of more of a basic buyer. They're not buying on behalf of a large organization, and they don't take necessarily huge risks in buying one order. But they're also not used to buying and having to import or import goods, let's say, into the US. Usually they're buying with goods that have already landed. And so they don't have the same kind of understanding of buyer requirements that a larger or a mid-ranged buyer would, because they're not taking on the responsibility of importation. So they are probably more used to just buying from people who have goods in the United States. You may have found this. They're used to LDP prices, not shipping costs from your FOB point. And so they don't have the knowledge of international standards that a mid-range buyer who maybe is buying from multiple stores is maybe doing their own direct sourcing in a different way and may be more accustomed to third-party audits, third-party testing. And then large buyers just doing that at a higher scale, at a larger scale, actually have their standards systematized. So you may have worked with buyers that send you a checklist or send you a guideline book that you have to read through that talks about the labeling requirements they have and the testing and the sample requirements they have. It's just all much more systematized because they are buying in larger quantities, they're doing direct sourcing, and they're used to bringing goods in from a manufacturer versus a wholesaler, which is what the basic buyer is more used to. So if you find this gap, that's what the gap is. You may find that your smaller buyer isn't as adept to what's happening as far as export is concerned, where your larger buyer is actually directing you to what their requirements are. And then you must hit those requirements to be able to move forward with that buyer. So that's just kind of a high level of how standards are interpreted or executed differently based on the size of the organization and the type of buying, wholesale buying versus direct source buying. So with any of those relationships, regardless of size, you want to make sure that you're clear on what your client's expectations are within testing. So I've just outlined some very testing and I would say just order requirements, right? So all the pre-production requirements that come from a larger buyer, and all the pre-production requirements that come from a smaller buyer. And so most of these you won't hear from the smaller buyer, you'll hear from the larger buyer, but it doesn't mean you don't have to be aware of these tests as an exporter. Okay, so you should be clear if you are required to run testing, third-party testing, as you're negotiating your order. Obviously, if you are, it's going to increase your cost. So it should be reflected in your selling cost if you have to do third-party testing. Okay, so that's why it's something to kind of get out there on the table early, so that you know what the expectations are, you know how to affect your cost, and of course, then ultimately affect your margin. So there's fabric and garment testing. This can be tested on a variety of things: flammability, crocking, wet crock, dry crock, fiber. So, you say it's 100% cotton, the buyer may want a test that says, yes, this has been tested and is 100% cotton. There's no synthetic in this fabric. Care instructions, etc. So the things that go into evaluating quality, performance of the product, so that, again, this is all to protect the buyer and ultimately to protect the consumer, so that the consumer doesn't buy a pair of new black jeans and get into a white leather seated car and have that dye go on to the leather. Then that turns into a lawsuit potentially for the seller. So this is all about, it's about product performance, and ultimately that's the thing that it guarantees, is product performance. But it's also about liability and who's taking liability, and making sure that the customer isn't holding at the end the liability, because that's going to then come back to the seller and eventually come back to the maker. So finished goods inspection and quality standards. There may be a particular process that a buyer requires for finished goods inspection and quality standards. If not, it's something for you to consider. We've talked about this in other webinars, how you want to maintain your own quality standards, for both maintaining your quality levels and also having a smooth production process that costs you less money to run. Production and quality reporting. If there's any requirements on like spot checking, and this comes with large orders. So this might not be something you're engaging with every day, but it could be something that comes up, which is a quality report, measuring critical points on the path of manufacturing to help everyone ensure the best quality. Transit and packing requirements specifically related to labeling. We're going to talk about that very quickly we will talk about that in the presentation. Labeling requirements, extremely important from regulation perspective. Also just based on what the buyer's requirements are. They want it in this place, and want it to say this if it's a private label order, etc. Garment and transit packaging requirements, how's it packaged, etc. That could be a big part of it as well. If there are any social or ethical compliance requirements or audits, that usually comes up pretty early in the conversation, because many times they want to do the audit before they do the production. So that would be one of your question, a question that would come up early in the process, because the order may be contingent on the audit. So if you don't pass the audit, they're not moving forward, or they are moving forward, but with a plan of action for the facility. Both of those can be expected. Environmental requirements. We'll talk a little bit about that in some of the standards for wood, which I know you're all aware of, probably just because of where you're from. That the wood requirements are high. And those are primarily to protect environmental standards and environmental resources. And then production standards, which I kind of touched on already. Sample requirements, maybe that should be at the very top. How many samples I always say to people, ask this question because it will erode your margin. How many samples do they need? Do they want pre-production samples, top of production samples? Do you not have to worry about that? If there's an answer to yes to any of those, it's going to drastically change your timeline, very important, and it's going to also affect your cost. So you want to know what your sampling requirements are for the buyer, and anything that's client specific, whether that's a tech pack or the information that they share. That's less about a requirement and more, something that you could expect. So let's go right into labeling. because that becomes important when we're, just generally speaking, when you're doing your own labeling. So for wearing apparel, the label must specify the actual fabric content and the instructions for care. It must be in English, and it must have the country of origin visible. Now, those can be one tag. You can put it all on one, or sometimes there's a main label that will have the country of origin, and then the care label can go on into a side seam or into a more discrete part of the garment. The reason I say that is because the country of origin must be in a legible, identifiable, permanent place on the article. What that means is that it has to be on the neck, it has to be in the waist, it has to be somewhere where it's very prominent where the product was made. The care, on the other hand, can go into the side seams. The one thing to know about wearing apparel is the bottom line standard, the lowest bar standard for importation into the United States is flammability. So I've given you here the link for the flammability standards based on the Customs Border Protection and what they say about what is necessary for flammability standards. You don't have to present a flammability test with your documentation. Your product just has to, if it falls into a flammability category, it has to pass. Now, there are varying standards for flammability.
It's 9 o'clock.
Thank you. Varying standards for flammability. So children's sleepwear, highest flammability standard. Women's wearing apparel, depending on the fiber content, lower. So I'm wearing a white cotton shirt. This has a very low flammability rate. It doesn't even really need to be tested. There are certain fabrics that you don't really have to test. If this shirt, instead of being like a cotton poplin, was a cotton gauze, gauze would flame at a much higher rate and might require a flammability test. Okay. So what this means is not everything requires a flammability test. One, it depends on the category of product, children's as the highest, women's as, or adult, I should say, as the lowest. It depends on the fiber content. And there's also another standard for rugs. Okay, you can find all of that here at this link. It's important to know about flammability in wearing apparel, particularly because it is a legal requirement. And so this is kind of, for apparel, kind of the lowest bar of testing that may need to be done for your buyer. Okay. So let's move into the base of what we're talking about today, which is home decor leather jewelry regulation. I wanted to put the textile in and I wanted to put the labeling in because those are important. If it's not I should say this, if it's not wearing apparel and it's a textile home article, it does not require the same level of flammability testing at all. Okay, so if you're doing home decor textiles, that flammability does not necessarily apply to you the way it would apply to you if you're doing apparel. Okay, so we're going to talk about wood and plant products in the home decor, leather, and accessories categories. We're going to talk about the Lacey Act and the phytosanitary certificate. For jewelry, we're going to talk about lead and cadmium testing. And for leather, we're going to talk about U.S. Fish and Wildlife permits. Okay. So let's just kind of jump into this. Okay. So for wood and natural products, the Lacey Act is what deems or regulates importation of these materials into the United States. The purpose is to combat illegal trafficking of wildlife, fish, and plants, and protect against the spread of disease as well, and insects that could negatively impact the ecosystem in the United States. It's administered, the Lacey Act, by the Department of Agriculture, and it is required for shipments and plants of products over $2,500. This is important. If you're selling to that smaller store that's not buying for 5 stores or 10 stores, but's buying for 1 store, and your order is under $2,500, you do not have to have the Lacey Act documentation in your shipping package. $2,500 or less, okay? So this is a big help if you're selling to the smaller mom and pops. That buyer is probably not aware of it because of their size, as we said earlier, and border protection doesn't require it because the value of the order. Okay, so important to know that this is contingent on the value of the shipment. Plant products can have local legal requirements, and this we're not going to get into as much. So, for example, depending upon where you are in the world and you're shipping a plant or natural fiber, your local Ministry of Lands or local Ministry of Agriculture, Natural Resources may require a documentation from the Forestry Department, from any of those other departments I mentioned, to actually export the goods. And that might not be contingent on the value of the shipment. Okay, so you should check and see from an export perspective, what does your country of origin require, and where would you obtain that certificate or that, submit that test. This is different for all countries. I gave the example of Zambia here because I did have this experience in Zambia, but it can be different for whatever country of origin you're working in. Okay, so ultimately, who is responsible for these documents? The importer or their agent, customs broker, is responsible to submit these documents in their document package. They may need from you to know some things about that product to fill out the document, okay? They may need to know the scientific plant name, the country that it's harvested from, the value of the product, the quantity of the plant material in the shipments in a metric unit. These are all things that they may have to fill out in their import form if the shipment is over $2,500. How do you know if the Lacey Act applies to you? You can, once you have your HTS code established, you can go to the USDA Animal Plant Health Inspection Service website, which I'm giving you here, and see if there's a flag for that particular HTS code requiring a Lacey Act document for importation. Again, as long as it's above $2,500. So here I'm showing you on the side here how you can check that and see if it's required or not. So effective, this is the effective date of when those would require that chapter, and that 10-digit code would require a test. Or not a test, a certificate that files under the Lacey Act. So then we have another potential certificate that is the phytosanitary and fumigation certificate. Fumigation, so this can have to do with any kind of natural material that the product is made of. So this could be corn, wheat, rice, straw, grasses for baskets, sticks, bark, bamboo, anything that's grown that could be contaminated by insects or disease, or even be a prohibitive plant. So maybe there are some plants that are on a list of prohibited to ship. So who is responsible? And this is an example, excuse me, of a phytosanitary certificate from Zambia. Okay, so this is going back to my slide. If you need a phytosanitary certificate from your country of origin, then this is what you would be filling out. Okay, who's responsible? The importer on record is responsible to apply for the agricultural import permit from the Department of Agriculture. Okay, so it's not, if you're not the importer on record, it's not your responsibility to file this in the United States, but it is your responsibility to, if you need a phytosanitary fumigation certificate from your country of origin, to have that in the documentation package for your importer. Okay. If you're the importer on record, let's say you're bringing your goods into a warehouse into the United States so you can ship more effectively into the US market, then yes, you are responsible for filling out this documentation as long as your value is $2,500 or less. Just be aware, and I've said this in other trainings, don't use that threshold to continually ship smaller unit orders because customs will catch on. So if you have, a 5,000 unit order and you break it up into 2,500 and send it at the same time, you're going to probably see a problem. So just be aware that is monitored, and that you can use it, but you need to be aware of how you use it, so to not abuse it, and lose not be holding into the requirements, or losing ability. So sorry, my laptop just went a little crazy. Okay, so here we are. So now let's talk about metal. You're probably aware of metal. There are, through the ASTM F2999 restriction, there are several substances, that's an act. There are several substances in adult jewelry that are prohibitive. And that is this list here, cannot be included in product. This act also covers product labeling requirements. It applies to the liquid fill of the jewelry. It applies to mechanical requirements, like it applies to clasps and chains and all the pieces of the piece, all the components, I should say, of the piece, are governed, and these substances cannot be a part of the product in jewelry. There are various state laws that also define jewelry testing, but the one that is used pretty much across the country is the California Proposition 65 Act. And so that is the one that kind of everybody uses and includes the restrictions of all of these substances. In jewelry, if you're working with a plant or a wildlife product, then the Lacey Act pops in here and governs those natural materials. So mother of pearl, conch, red coral, sea turtle. And that's about the same thing we talked about previously with the Lacey Act. So protection of natural resources in the country of from the country of origin, protection from any natural, bug infestation, etc. And then the ability for you to export that material out of your country of origin based on what your country requires with natural materials such as mother of pearl, conch, etc. So This is a standard kind of material regulation for jewelry items. Now, with leather is governed under the U.S. Federal Trade Commission, and they publish guidelines for selected products to prevent or misrepresent material. When it comes to exotic leather goods sourced from foreign wildlife, that will require an import license from the U.S. Fish and Game Service. And leather sourced from protected species may require additional regulation. So, and then there is a convention of international trade of endangered species, and what that list are. And so species to be aware have either a higher level of regulation or are not allowed based on the convention to be imported. The list of domestic species that are exceptions from these are camel, cattle, goat, and sheep. So those are not part of, they do not cover these endangered species, and they are, they don't have additional requirements for importation. So when it comes to home decor and accessory regulations from a testing perspective, again, the label of the product requires accurate fiber content, an accurate country of origin located visibly in the product. So this, for labeling, you have more variety of where you can put it than you can with apparel. Apparel has to be visible. This can be in a side seam, in, not as visible, but the information is required. Accurate fiber content, and the accurate country of origin. If linings are included, and I'll show you a case study at the end, then any of those other multiple materials do need to be listed from highest to lowest value as it is in the product. So if the main basket is wicker, but it has a horn button, then the horn button is last and the wicker is first. So all of that material, and it needs a percentage of what percentage that product is. So for product testing, you want to look at we're looking at what is required to manage toxicity of materials, chemical certifications, or quality assurance. Okay, so what I'm saying is this is a variety of different tests that may be required based on, you can either be measuring toxicity, chemical, or quality. So for jewelry that's painted or wood that is stained, it needs to be tested for lead and cadmium free. That's not, it has to be void of lead and cadmium free in those qualities. Items for food use need to be tested for food safety. If you're not planning to use it for food, it needs to have a sticker on it that says this is a decorative item. This is not for use in food. For leather items, color fastness, color crocking, chromium, formaldehyde, and pentachlorylphospholine are harmful substance testings. So you may need to test for those to be sure that they are not included in your leather. You can also go to your leather supplier and ask them for a list of the chemicals that they do use to tan the leather and see what is included, and help you to determine if these are included. Then you may not want to work with that particular supplier, or ask them if they can reduce for your order to take something off, which is a little bit harder. For luggage straps, there's a strength test that should be done to handle the strength of the strap, the strength of the seams, to see if there's seam strength and abrasion testing. Excuse me. Excuse me. And then for textile accessories, this would be anything from a scarf to a tie. There's flammability, colored fastness, fiber content, fiber strength, and fiber construction. And that goes for accessories as well. Even though the flammability may not be part of it, because the fabric could be very heavy and not really require a textile flammability test because of the weight of the fabric. So all of these labels, all labeling requirements are regulated by U.S. Customs. Product and fiber testing for consumer protection are regulated by Customs. And other testing may be optional based on the buyer's standards. Okay, so we're just going through the very basic, that is U.S. Customs required, or Customs border protection, right? So with your labeling, you want to know how to label your product so that it complies to U.S. Customs. For testing, you only really want to look at what testing may be required for Customs regulation, unless your buyer has asked you for additional standards that's based on their testing protocol for their customer. Okay. So understanding that there's a difference between what Customs requires and what your buyer requirements. That goes back up to that first slide we talked about, and how buyers may have different requirements based on the size of their business. Okay, so here's just a case study of a bag made in Eswatini that has a lot of different components on it that I thought could be a good example to kind of walk through the testing. So the product itself is made of a natural fiber, which is a straw. It has vegetable tan leather as accents. It has a cotton twill lining and a cow horn button. So the most important thing to do is to first identify your HTS code via U.S. International Trade Administration Commission's website or Logic Tree, which I've shared before, to determine your HTS code. So here we go. We come down into the 46 category. 46 is for baskets. And we drill down to find that there is other baskets and bags, whether or not lined, wicker work. So that's a wicker work basket. Whether or not lined. And so we see that in general, it's free. And here in other, it is A and D, which means A is AGOA and D is GSP. So that is duty free in that HS category, describing this particular item as closely as possible. And it represents duty free classification. So that's one thing. Okay. So now that you've determined if the product is GSP or AGOA eligible, this is now talking about you want to just make sure that you're in a country that accepts either GSP or AGOA country status, which you all are. And then from a product perspective, when determining your HS code, look in the special column for A, indicating of GSP, and D, indication of AGOA, which we just went through. So this is just a simple exercise in looking at a complex product and how to identify the HS code. It's kind of going back from standards, like one step before standards, and saying, is this product eligible for duty free? And the answer is, if you're in a duty-free country or in a GOA country, this product can ship duty-free. Okay, so now let's look at the regulation that might that may be part of the process of getting this product into the United States under U.S. Customs Border Protection. So the product is a handmade natural fiber vegetable tan, cotton twill lining, and cow horn. So in general, you want to make sure that your labeling is compliant with U.S. regulation. The most important thing there is that you list from highest value to lowest value the fibers that are in that product. Okay, that everything is accounted for and a percentage is given. So even if it's, 3% of the product is horn, that's, that would be allotting a percentage with all components equaling 100 to your care label. Now for the basket body, we just did this. We want to make sure that the HTS code falls. If the HTS code falls under the Lacey Act, then flag the buyer that it does. So once you've established your HTS code, we want to make sure that if the Lacey Act applies, that your buyer is aware of that. If she or he is the importer on record. If you're the importer on record, then it falls on you to make sure of this. Ensure that the basket part of the production is fumigated with your countries of origin's phytosanitary certification. So the fumigation happens in your country of origin. See if this classification requires it. And then last, you may want to do color fastness testing. Color fastness testing is not US regulatory. You don't have to do that for your documentation package. That's just a question about product performance, and it could be that something your buyer might want to do or you might want to do just to protect your product in the market. Okay, now for the leather components, we want to depending on where the leather is sourced and from which wildlife source. So we listed the ones that are open, that are okay to source, that don't require any special legal documentation. Ensure the buyers know what import licenses are required for U.S. fishing game. Okay. And then you could look at color fastness, color crocking, and harmful substance testing as part of that. Let me just go back here for a second. So again, I'm just gonna, it can sound complicated sometimes because there's different parts of the process are regulated by different agencies. Some of them are domestic, some of them are in the US. So the general rule is the labeling compliant. And so that's just you knowing your materials, labeling them properly, and labeling them in the percentage that they represent in the product, making sure that the country of origin is there. It can be all together in this particular case, because it's a bag, you can put it all together. If it was apparel, you would want to separate those and have that country of origin in the main label. You want to check your product, your silhouette here, which is the basket itself, and make sure that it falls under Lacey Act. And if it does, let the buyer know that it does, because that requires a special document from their customs agent. Ensure that the basket parts of productions are fumigated. That's your side. So if you need to fumigate a basket to have it leave your country of origin from your Ministry of Natural Resources or from another legal authority, then that you want to provide for that document package. The color testing is strictly about if the buyer requirement, if the buyer requires it, then you should do it. Should figure out who's going to pay for it. The test is about $300. And know if it's a requirement of your buyer, kind of going back to where we started, high, low, or small, medium, large size buyer. This is the color fastness test is not a US regulatory test. That's a buyer test. And so it could be not required, depending on what your buyer's instructions are. The leather component, you want to know where the leather is sourced and from what wildlife species. And from there, let your buyer know that they may need an import license from US Fish and Game on the US side to import that. Also, you want to check on your side to make sure that you don't have to have any additional documentation filled out for your leather. Color fastness, color crocking, and harmful substance testing are not US regulatory required. Those are buyer requirements. And so you may want to know if you want to test that as part of this order. I just went through that again a little bit slower, just because it's quite a lot of information. Okay, you can find more information at all of these sources. AGOA info has a lot of guidelines and infographics. You can break it down by industry sector, export resources, download a toolkit, read the trade acronyms. A really good place to just kind of become more familiar with the legalities of shipping under AGOA, US Customs Border Protection regulation, and the systems that are required when shipping these types of product into the United States. Okay. We are at 9:30, which is the end of the session, but we did start late. So I would welcome any questions that anyone has to help me to make this more digestible or just easier for you. So please let me know how I can break this down or help you more so.
Thank you so much. My name is Anne, and I'm very appreciative for the information that you've shared with us. And yeah, my question would be on the fiber, natural fiber and coloring. So I mainly deal with sisal baskets.
Okay.
So because I don't do much with the sisal basket, and maybe I can give you a scenario. If I want to maybe to supply to Target, and I have my sisal baskets and I'm selling to them as planters, so do I have to have the AGOA license first?
No, not first.
Or how will AGOA come in when me and Target decide to do business?
Certainly. Great question. So I'm going to give you some very basic things that you can do to check. And the next time we do an AGOA webinar, I'll also make sure, Anne, that you're invited to that. So I do a larger presentation all about AGOA. So the thing to remember about AGOA is you don't have to be registered as an AGOA exporter. AGOA is a shipping system, is a trade preference program that to ship under AGOA and retain the duty-free advantage, you have to submit certain documents in your export package. So the main document is the certificate of origin. And then these testing documents can then fall under that certificate of origin. For your product, the first thing you want to do is you want to go to agoa.info. And if you want to sell sisal planters to Target, you want to check what the HTS code would be for sisal planters. I think it might fall under the 46th chapter, which is the same chapter I used for the bag. And you want to find that code, and you want to check and see if you are in an AGOA eligible country, which I'm sure you are, that product is AGOA eligible. Now, basket planters usually should not have a problem. Sometimes there are little glitches on things that they make the product itself, the product characteristics makes it non-eligible. But in your product, I think you'll have no problem finding the proper HTS code and seeing that D or that E that says it is AGOA eligible. So that's the first thing you want to do, even before you show any product to Target, because you want to make sure that you can say to them, all of these products, what country are you in, Anne?
I am in Kenya.
In Kenya. Okay, I thought so. So all of the products I'm showing you can ship duty free from Kenya to the United States, so that they know that they're getting that benefit when they're looking at your product selection. Now, as far as your testing goes, I would say that Target is going to be that high volume, high restriction kind of a buyer. So they will explain to you at a point in the process. First, you're going to go through your presentation, your pricing, etc. You want to get from them their buyer requirements guideline, or like their import guideline book as soon as possible, so that you know what kind of tests are required by them as a large supplier. Then when you're in the position to do your pricing, then you have the information you need and can, inflate your price as required for the testing. They will be the importer on record, again, because of their size. The only thing they may ask you for some assistance on is possibly if they're going to air the goods, do you have a recommended air carrier? If they're going to vessel the goods, they may already have with their other, they use like certain vessel lines. And then the thing to be ready for is when they're filling all this out, if they're the importer on record, you may need to come back and say, that sisal is made from this particular palm or this particular leaf or this, and the scientific name is this. And it is not regulated in our country as a natural resource, like a protected natural resource, because it grows in abundance. So that they're aware of what your job is, to be aware of what does Kenya require for you to ship sisal baskets to the United States and document in regulatory documentation. And then in addition to that, what might the buyer want you to do to fulfill their testing requirements, in addition to them filling out the Lacey Act, because it's protecting a plant. And then all you really need to do is give them that information so that they can fill it out for you. Or not for you, but fill it out for customs.
Okay, thank you.
Is that clear?
Yeah, it's very clear on my side. Very well understood. And on the fumigation, yes, I have gone through the process and I know the process. I've done it before. And on my side, I can say it's easier. Good. So yeah, my question was on the AGOA, which you have replied very well. So just a final, on the same breath of us getting market to the US, one more question would be, do you match sellers and buyers from the US in Africa?
Do you say that one word? Do you match?
Do you match sellers and buyers like shops and mini stores that want things from Africa? Do you do the matching? Like
Yes.
if they're looking for suppliers, can you match us with the shops
Yes, I
in
can.
the US? I don't know whether I'm sorry.
Yes, no, it's very clear. I completely understand what you're talking about. So in addition to the PVP platform, does Bahavana help to reach out to buyers that are interested in sellers, and in this particular case, interested in sisal planter baskets or other things that you also make in Kenya? And so the
Yes.
answer is yes, but not right now within this scope. So what we're working on, because this is USAID funded, is we're working to have USAID expand our scope so that we can provide the training and then also bring buyers to the table as well. To do general introductions, there's lots of different levels that we can do. But yes, we have a long history of doing buyer-seller matchmaking, is what we call it, with companies like West Elm, Anthropology, Free People, Eileen Fisher. But it is a very targeted service. And it's a bit labor intensive. So we're trying on this next round to see if USAID would like to continue to work with us and then add that aspect into our portfolio of services for you, the client. So I would just say stay tuned.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. Highly appreciated.
You're very welcome, Anne. Excellent questions.
Thank you.
Other questions from what I'm talking about? And Anne's question really helps to, that's why I chose the case study, to try to have like a real live experience, like the live experience of Anne selling sisal baskets. There are certain things that are required. So the Lacey Act is required, potentially. The testing of the color fastness and things could be, if she's selling to Target, it's definite because of the size. So Anne helps us kind of show how the whole picture works based on volume, risk, and just US regulations, and then your country of origin regulation. So when you start breaking it out like this into pieces, I think it becomes a little less complex. My job, I feel, is to deconstruct and demystify what it means to ship to the United States. And as long as you know those regulations and how to work within those regulations, and you match that to the size of your buyer, and those requirements will increase the higher the profile of the buyer or the more they're buying, that, and then you just know your documentations for AGOA, that's kind of like your trifecta. Buyer requirements, US regulatory requirements, AGOA requirements. And when you break it down like that, it does become, I think, more manageable. It doesn't feel as overwhelming. And I hope that comes across in some way in this presentation. Any other questions before we convene for the day? Okay. This last slide is to just remind you that we have an AGOA advisor email address. That is there's 4 of us on the email. And so if you have a question, if you have like a real life situation, and we handle these all the time, I really just want you to know like how we can be a resource to you. If you're shipping, I'm going to use Anne's example. If you're shipping for the first time to Target and you just got their export guide and you're reading it and you're confused, and you could email us and say, I'm trying to ship a 15,000 unit order to Target. I just got their buyer's guide. Can you walk me through it? The answer is yes. That's what we're here to do. We want to help you in a real-time way get through these questions so that you can successfully ship under AGOA. And so use the AGOA advisory email address to ask us specific questions. If you're working on a specific order, we have found that this can be extremely helpful. We have helped small women-owned companies in Togo and Benin, in Eswatini, in Kenya, to like actively work on their order. You know, so do I fill this out? What about this? Tell me where there's a lab. Tell me what kind of documents I need to complete. So I spend a moment here because there's only so much you can learn in a hour presentation. Of course, your business is the ultimate learning ground, and it's the one that matters the most. If you're engaging with a buyer, you want to make the most of that. So if we can help you, we are here to do that. Email us at agoaadvisors@bahawanaworldproject.com, and we can try to help you and walk you through some things and help. Our objective would be for your shipment to go as smoothly as possible and for you to continue to work with that buyer partly because of that. So with that, I wish you all the very best. It's a pleasure always to be with you and to share this information, and to wish you the very best in all of your individual business goals. And of course, best wishes to your families as well. Thank you for taking the time today to meet with me. It is always, I always enjoy this. It's really a pleasure to be able to do this on a small scale basis. And slowly, we will all learn. We are all learning together how to take most advantage of AGOA and have that be an advantage to your individual business and the products that you make. So once again, many thanks. Have a lovely afternoon, and we'll see each other again soon. Thank you.